Welcome back to another episode of the Corporate Gossip Podcast. Before we get started, I get to do my favorite thing. Shout out the people who bought us coffees. This week we have Wilson from Van and at Manager Method, aka Ashley. Manager Method, if you follow her on TikTok, she also has a podcast coming out with HR Manifesto and humorous resources. It's going to be so funny and educational and informational, and I cannot wait. I think it drops next week on October 16th, if I remember correctly. You can support the podcast and get a shout out by clicking the Buy Us a Coffee link in the show notes. And one more note. This episode has a lot of characters and 2 of them have the same name. So I put a handy family tree in the show notes and an expanded character description with pictures in the Substack so you can follow along. Enjoy the show. Kaufman is a classic rural North Texas town. Driving down South Washington Street, the city's main drag, you'll pass a mix of small businesses, Donut Palace, a few auto part shops, and even a video store, still in service today. Sprinkled along the street are modest single-floor homes that make up Kaufman's tight-knit community of 7,000. And on October 22nd, 1999, a jury selected from this community reached a verdict in a massive wrongful death lawsuit against a powerful corporation. The plaintiff was David Smalley, a 43-year-old mechanic from an unincorporated town called Lively, 15 miles south of the courtroom, whose unimaginable suffering was being contemplated by the court. 3 years prior, Smalley's daughter, Danielle, and her friend, Jason Stone, were killed when leaking liquid butane from a nearby pipeline exploded as the 2 teens started their car's ignition. The explosion was mammoth, sending pillars of flames 200 feet in the air. Reverberations could be felt several miles away. When the fire was extinguished, Danielle and Jason lay unrecognizable, completely incinerated by the blast. The pipeline was owned and operated by Koch Industries. They had tried to settle with Smalley, offering $1 million and then $10 million, but Smalley wanted to stare down the company executives, Charles and David Koch, and tell them what was stolen from him. Over 12 days, the jury was presented with evidence that Koch Industries was mercilessly profit-obsessed, and that fixation led to delaying or even neglecting to address issues including corrosion, exposed pipelines, and leaks. Managers routinely calculated the cost of repair compared to the cost of a lawsuit related to negligence. Here's what the Texas Attorney General had to say about the case.
Given the time value of money and the rate of return on money invested, Koch made a profit from its repeated decisions to delay implementing standard maintenance procedures and necessary repairs.
On the final day of trial, David Smalley took the stand and got his moment to confront the Koch brothers.
Money to them is blood. That's all it is. That's their life force, is money. That's all they care about. They're so greedy, you know, it's just greed. They put the value of a human life to a piece of paper that says this is money. I choose the life, not the paper. But that's the only way I can hurt them, is to take them for every penny that I can get.
The plaintiff's attorney asked the jury to return a $100 million verdict in his client's favor. They did not. Instead, they awarded David Smalley $296 million, at that point, the largest wrongful death award in U.S. history. The plaintiff's counsel dropped to their knees. Koch's lawyers, on the other hand, looked like they were about to be sick. Over the past 3 decades, the brothers at the top of the billion-dollar conglomerate named for their father had extracted their wealth, tens of billions of dollars by the late 90s, by flagrantly disregarding regulations, ethics, and human life. They stole oil from Native American lands, spewed hundreds of thousands of gallons of crude into protected wetlands and riverbeds, dumped another 600,000 gallons of jet fuel into the Mississippi, and vented massive amounts of butane into the Texas air. They'd emit tens of millions of metric tons of greenhouse gases into the air every single year. And they knew what they were doing. They tried to cover up each of these crimes. Evidence of the cover-ups would be disclosed as the government put Koch on trial over and over again, eventually running up hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and settlements. But it was too late. The Koch brothers, Freddie, Charles, David, and Billy, had already amassed a level of wealth that catapulted them to a different plane of existence. $100 million in regulatory violations to them was like a parking ticket to us. And more importantly, their extreme wealth gave them the ability to change the rules that they didn't like. The brothers went on to spend untold amounts of money supporting anti-regulation political candidates who would cut them sweetheart deals if they did see the business end of a DOJ investigation. Then they established Citizens for a Sound Economy. The conservative political action group called itself a grassroots organization, but was in fact AstroTurf, lobbying on behalf of Koch Industries and its allies. In 2009, Citizens for a Sound Economy would rebrand and become the Tea Party movement. Many argue that today's untenable political divisiveness can be, in parts, traced back to the Koch brothers' surreptitious brinkmanship. In 2018, David Koch died at 79 years old of prostate cancer. The public reaction? Good riddance. His 83-year-old surviving brother Charles read through the eulogy slack-jawed. The cutthroat, every man for himself libertarian was suddenly faced with the harsh truth. Everybody fucking hates me. Over the next few years, Charles would begin the process of rebranding, starting with his first name. "Call me Chucky Koch," he says in a Wall Street Journal article, where he calls his partisanship a mistake. "I hate to be the one to break it to you, Chucky, but it's too late to apologize. Your legacy is already memorialized in the sinking southern cities, the burning Canadian forests, and the greasy hairline of Tea Party talking head Ted Cruz." This is the Corporate Gossip Podcast, the Koch family, Toxic Kings. Speed
means
go. Welcome back to another episode of the Corporate Gossip Podcast. Hell hath no fury like a CPA scorned. And that's me, your host, Becca Platsky, and I'm here with my co-host...
Numbers. Data analytics playboy, Adam Platsky.
And producer Mike. Today we are talking about Koch Industries. Pronunciation is key here, kiddos. So why should you care about Koch Industries? Maybe you're like, I've literally never heard of this company before in my life. The truth is this story is similar to the episode that we're doing on McKinsey. It's companies that you might not have heard of, but have a huge impact on your life and you don't even know it. Koch is an empire. There's thousands of employees, billions of dollars in revenue. I mean, they've got offices across the globe. You have interacted with this company if you have ever worn spandex, lived in a home that uses drywall. I don't know any home that doesn't. Put your kids in diapers, used heat. I mean, literally everything. Oh, yeah. And put gasoline in your car. And the other thing that's interesting, it's not just the products that you use that this company impacts, it's also the people that you vote for. In 2023 alone, Koch announced a $70 million super PAC against President Trump. So, and that's, by the way, before we get into this, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. These aren't diehard liberals. They want to trounce President Trump and put, I think, Ron DeSantis in his place, right?
Diehard libertarians.
Correct. And this story has everything. It has court battles. It has private investigators. It has homosexual blackmail. It has NICOLE SMITH, sibling rivalry, and libertarian summer camp. And in honor of that, Adam and I are wearing our non-libertarian summer camp t-shirts, just regular summer camp that we used to go to as a kid. But let's get into it. Let's go back to the beginning. Are you ready, Adam?
Let's do it.
The first piece of corporate gossip, Mike, if you could take us to the next slide. And just as a reminder, guys, if you're watching on YouTube, you can follow along with the pictures that we're showing, or you can click in the show notes and you can pull up our Substack article. This episode in particular has a ton of pictures. So the first piece of corporate gossip is duck, duck, Fred Koch Sr. dies of a heart attack. You like that, Mike?
I didn't expect it.
November 1967, Fred Koch Sr. is in a duck blind. So that means he's hunting for ducks in Utah. He had not really shot well that day, but he finds a bird in the horizon and he triggers his gun. I don't know the right word. Squeezes the trigger and the bird falls from the sky. And he says, oh, boy, that was a magnificent shot. And then he dropped dead. He's 67 at the time of his death. He leaves behind his wife, Mary Clementine Koch, and their 4 sons, Fred, Charles, and twins, David and Bill. And in an instant, his second son, Charles, takes the helm of the company. He's 32. At that time, the revenue of the various Koch subsidies had reached about $400 million. Today, that's $3.5 billion. And 32 is like the average age of the people in this room. Could any of us manage a company that size? I mean, it's not huge, but it's respectable. Like companies with $3.5 billion in revenue, speaking of which, are like iHeartMedia, Bausch & Lomb, Burberry, and you're dealing with the traumatic death of your father and an epic fight between you and your 3 siblings.
Such a sad death, too. Just Fred and the guy who holds his gun.
Yeah, his, like, I guess it would be a hunting caddy.
His hunting caddy.
Very sad death and a sudden death. I don't think I'd be able to manage that. So anyway, we will get into the family drama within the Koch family when we talk about each of the siblings. But for now, let's do a little deep dive and explore the founder of Koch Enterprises, Fred Koch Sr. Go to the next slide, Mike. This is J. Howard Marshall II, a very good friend of Fred Koch Sr. and husband of Anna Nicole Smith. I don't remember him looking like, I remember this as like a pop culture moment, but I don't remember that that's what he looked like.
Well, I bet
she's so pretty.
Yeah, she is really, she kept him satisfied.
Yes.
With Werther's Originals.
So you know what they say, the people you surround yourself with are a reflection of you. Well, Fred Koch's best friend was J. Howard Marshall, and he was business associates with Hitler, allegedly. He was also a founding member of the John Birch Society, which was like mid-century QAnon, and whose goal was to harvest the Earth's resources for themselves under the cover of fighting against communism and socialism. This is a club where people like Willis Allison Carto, who was a far-right political activist and a Holocaust denier, William Luther Pierce, a neo-Nazi and white supremacist who wrote the novel that inspired the Oklahoma City bombing, and inventor of the boysenberry and Knott's Berry Farm, William Knott.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I know. I didn't know that the boysenberry was something that had been invented. So, you know, I bet the bar after the funeral was a real safe space for bigots who love carnival rides. Go to the next slide, Mike. Here's one of the last pictures of Fred Koch. Charles Koch would end up adopting some of his father's anti-communist, anti-socialist beliefs, and he will bastardize them even further to serve his own needs, but more on that later. So a few weeks after the funeral, Charles finds a letter his dad had written him when the kids were little, and it talks about what they should do with their inheritance.
It may be either a blessing or a curse. You can use it as a valuable tool for accomplishment, or you can squander it foolishly. If you choose to let this money destroy your initiative and independence, then it will be a curse to you, and my action in giving it to you will have been a mistake. I should regret very much to have you miss the glorious feeling of accomplishment, and I know you're not going to let me down. Remember that often adversity is a blessing in disguise, and is certainly the greatest character builder. Be kind and generous to one another, and be good to your mother.
That was great, Mike. Fred Koch Sr. knew he was leaving a good chunk of change to his kids, and he didn't want them to squander it. And in retrospect, I really wish that these kids would have just squandered their wealth on yachts and racehorses, because all of us would be much better off.
They could have taken a few lessons from their uncle J. Howard Marshall.
Seriously. So how did Koch amass all this wealth? At this point, Koch Industries is $50 million in value. That's about $500 million today. And he left 20% to Charles, Bill, and David, and 14% to Fred Jr. And all of his property and his art collection goes to his wife. And at the time, Fred's holding also included 4 ranches, a crude oil gathering and refining business, some minor oil exploration interests, and Koch engineering companies. And all these assets would eventually be consolidated under Charles and renamed Koch Industries. one of the key things that made him so successful is his development in 1927 of a more efficient thermal cracking process for oil refining. I'm not going to get into any more of the details because I don't understand it, but it essentially improves the yields for these refineries. Everything was dandy until one of Koch's employees committed light patent infringement and locked Fred out of business for a few years in America. But luckily for Fred, in the Soviet Union, intellectual property rights aren't recognized. So he signed a couple of contracts. He built petroleum distillation plants in the Soviet Union. This is today's Russia. And ultimately, this is where he becomes radicalized and traumatized and is never able to intellectualize it. He sees a lot of crazy things under Stalin. He's seeing some of his colleagues purged by the regime. That's killed. It's very traumatic. And he does what so many boomers do. They experience these extreme and dangerous governments, either in Eastern Europe or in South America, and they just take that and they run as far away as they can to the other extreme, radical libertarianism. And this is what inspires him to be one of the founding members of the John Birch Society to, quote unquote, fight communism and fight socialism. Because in his mind, socialism means my colleagues get murdered.
Okay.
So by the mid-1950s, the family fortune is secured. And by the early 1960s, Fred Koch Sr. has this massive business empire that he's running from Wichita, and he needs to figure out which one of his sons to entrust it to. So let's move to the next piece of corporate gossip. Growing up Koch. So we got Billy and David are on the bottom. I believe that's Billy on the bottom left, and then David's on the right, and then Charles on the top left, and then Freddie on the top right. So here's how the book, oh yeah, I forgot to show you guys the book. So here is the book. I read the book Sons of Wichita, How the Koch Brothers Became America's Most Powerful and Private Dynasty by Daniel Schulman. And you read
I read Cochland, The Secret History of Koch Industries and Corporate Power in America by Christopher Leonard.
Both great books. You can find them both on our bookshop.org storefront in the link in our show notes. So anyway, here's how the book The Sons of Wichita describes the family environment. So Schulman says, this was not a lovey-dovey family. This was a family where the father was consumed by his own ambition, the mother was trapped by generation and wealth and surrounded by alpha males, and the boys only had each other. But they were so busy in pursuit of their father's approval that they never noticed what they could do for each other. Everything goes back to the love they didn't get as children, says a family friend. So let's start with Fred, aka Freddie.
Oh,
Freddie's my favorite. I mean, it's not hard to be my favorite son out of, you'll hear the turds that the rest of them turn into. But the oldest son is born August 26, 1933. He's a Virgo. Freddie's the outlier among his rough and tumble, ultra-competitive brothers. The three younger brothers take after their dad, and he's much closer with his mom. They go to art shows together and plays, and honestly, that skeeved his dad out. He thought that Freddie was overly effeminate. And the more girly his son acted, the more Fred Sr. tried to toughen him up. And eventually, Freddie has a mental breakdown during a summer of forced labor at the family ranch.
Forced labor is a theme.
Seriously.
For the Kochs.
Fred Koch thought that the reason that Freddie turned out to be effeminate, in his words, is because he was too loving and too kind to him. And so he really flipped the script on his younger kids, and he would even pit them against each other. They'd fight to get his attention. This is a classic billionaire father pastime. We saw this with the Murdochs, and we saw this with other familial dynasties. And I write this right here, right? So similar to the Murdoch family, Koch's oldest child kind of taps out of the family fight to succeed his father, kind of like Prudence. And this is from the book. You didn't hear much about Freddie. It was almost as if he wasn't part of the family. In fact, a 1960 bio, Freddie isn't even mentioned. Fred and Mary have 3 children, David, Charles, and Billy. The same thing happened with the Murdochs. Remember, he didn't even mention Prudence in a biography. Mary lamented that her eldest son had a quote-unquote inferiority complex that prevented him from creating anything. Fred just felt Freddie should have indulged his pleasures in art, music, and literature when he could have created something. And I'm just I want billionaire children to do more of this. Just do art. Don't stop buying companies, stop cosplaying Boss Boy. Just be more like Freddie, okay? So Fred goes to Harvard, he studies humanities, and he ends up having a pretty interesting life. And there are always rumors that Freddie is gay. It's never confirmed, but in college, this is actually a really cute story. In the late 1950s, he becomes a follower of the One Institute of Homophile Studies, an organization for gays and lesbians founded in 1956, and he subscribes to their quarterly journal. In a 1959 letter to the organization requesting a copy of the book it had published called Homosexuals Today, he also inquired whether the Institute was, quote, familiar with a booklet or pamphlet listing by name and by address the gay bars and restaurants in various European cities. If you are aware of the title and editorial address of the publication, I should appreciate receiving this information. This is so sweet.
He just came up with Yelp.
I know. Yeah, he did.
And Grindr, sort of.
Yes. It's really sweet, and it's also sad. And it seems like he might have lived most of his life closeted, at least to his family. I hope that at least in New York City, he ended up having some support system.
I'm sure he had so much fun. Remember, you can't choose your family, but you can choose your friends.
That's so true. And I'm sure, and we'll go on to talk a little bit about his personal life. And he's hobnobbing with Queen Elizabeth. He's pretty well respected outside of his own family. And so I hope that he's getting that support.
He's a socialite.
That he's not getting from his family. Because it's funny, because in the book, it talks about when he's home for his holidays, that even if his brothers don't love him, his parents' friends love him. So it says, on periodic visits home to Wichita for the holidays, he joined his mother on the weekly cocktail party circuit. Fred was rarely ever seen at these confabs, his dad, right? Freddie used to love to go to these cocktail parties and gatherings, remembers one fellow party goer. He was very good at conversation, and he was always interested in what other people were doing, he added. Other people outside the family from Wichita were very impressed with Freddie by the things he had done and the good causes he had supported. In Wichita, Freddie was the most liked of all four brothers in the sense that he often went to these cocktail parties. He socialized more with our parents' generation. I love him.
He's an old soul.
He really is.
Yeah, I was reading this. I got a glimpse back of Sonia Morgan's famous Wednesday gay parties at her Upper East Side townhouse. Woman Sonia, she invites the gays over every Wednesday night, and they have just a drinking and talk about the arts. And Freddie is the gays, and Sonia Morgan is Freddie's mom. And they just go out together and hobnob around Wichita.
Yeah. So I actually extrapolated on your idea a little bit, and I assigned each of the brothers.
Some creative freedoms, I see.
Yes, I assigned each of the brothers OG New York housewives. Freddie is Sonia. Charles is Bethany, in the sense that everyone thinks Charles is so successful and great at business, but he's really just a complete bully and jealous of the fact that everyone loves Sonia. Luann is Billy. In the sense that maybe I think sobriety would be good for him. And David is Ramona, an absolute maniac, radical conservative.
I think David is Ramona, but Hampton's Ramona.
Yes. All right. So next up we have Charles. But did you read in your research that he's trying for a rebrand?
No, I read this and was cackling last night in front of the TV. I thought this was a joke.
No,
it's not a joke.
Charles is trying for a rebrand. He now wants to go by Chucky.
Yeah, because the name Chucky's not synonymous with anything else.
Anyway, Mary gives birth to another boy in November 1935. Following family tradition established by Fred's father, they named their second son after a business associate. And do you remember this happened in the Enron episode as well, where Andy Fastow named his first son after Jeff Skilling? So now I'm wondering if this is more common than we're giving it credit for. Even though the Kochs were wealthy by Wichita standards, their parents didn't want to raise...
Which is what? By Wichita standards in 1935, what is that? Having lumber?
I don't know what that means. That's just what the book said.
No, I know. I'm just trying to...
It's not New York City standards, right? So, but the parents didn't want to raise, quote unquote, country club bums. And they did live across the street from a country club. Their father was quite tight with resources, recalled an elementary school friend of the Kochs. He did not shower them with toys and that kind of thing until well into the 1950s. Fred refused to buy a television. Every family was getting a TV set that could possibly afford one, but Fred Sr. just said no. He was a real hard ass.
Everybody's watching Al Jolson. The poor Koch boys can't turn on Al Jolson.
Mike, will you go to the next picture? And so here they are on this ranch where they're doing forced labor. That's Charles on the right and then David on the left. And it looks like maybe they had just chopped, I don't know,
a bushel
3 tons of wood.
Wait, when you say forced labor, it's on their land, like their family
it's their dad
land?
making them do this labor for summer.
That's normal stuff. I have to step up for the dad.
It just seems that when you couple what you're seeing here, these kids don't look thrilled. They don't look proud of themselves. They look like, okay, Dad, are you good? And when you couple that with some of the abuse that we'll see later on, both financial and emotional, it gives it, in retrospect, not the quaint story that they're trying to tell, I guess. So,
do you know, just to be clear, you know, all the times that I can drill wood together, build a deck, fix the outlet, change the electricity, get all that stuff done. When the toilet breaks, I can fix it. That's because I did forced labor as a kid. I did all that stuff that my dad made me do. So I have great. This one particular thing, I'm with the Kochs
I think
on this.
that's great, but I think it's set and setting. It's context. This was not here's
I got you.
Well, let's listen to this quote.
I would like to see where Apple Paltrow ends up.
Apple
Paltrow. No, but to be fair, I think to Mike's point, there's some level that's good and there's some level that's extreme, and then there's Apple Paltrow.
Yes,
and I don't know Apple Paltrow, so I don't know what she's doing with her.
Well, I can clean. I know how to fix stuff, chop wood, do landscaping, and Apple will know how to make booby-scented candles. You know what I mean?
Well, Gwyneth Paltrow is also a Nepo baby.
I just learned that. Yeah,
Blythe Tanner is her. And Gwyneth Paltrow famously said that it's actually harder for a Nepo baby to get into Hollywood.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think a little forced labor would have been good for Gwyneth.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Who's Gwyneth's parents?
Blythe Tanner.
Exactly.
So here's a quote that I think is 1 point for me. This was a quote from a family friend. Fred was just very stiff. He was a calculated businessman. I don't mean this in a critical way, but his interest was not in the kids, other than the fact that he wanted them well educated. He was not the kind of dad who played catch with his boys. Rather, he was the type of father, one Koch relative said, who taught his children to swim by throwing them into the pool and walking away. And as we know somebody in our lives who had that happen to them. Their dad threw them into the pool and then walked away in order to teach them to swim. And would you say that for that person, that isn't a very significant trauma that they carry with them to this day?
I have no comment. I won't comment. But that's pretty typical. Is what I also have met other people who.
I guess it's typical of the time, but that doesn't excuse it. And I love this quote because the guy's like, I don't mean this in a critical way, but this guy was an abusive narcissist. And at this point, when we go back in time and we revisit the childhoods of CEOs on this podcast, we just need to issue a blanket trigger warning for child abuse.
No, it's the Dewey Finn Code of Conduct from School of Rock. And I think Jack Black was inspired by Fred Sr.
You know what? You don't have to worry about me because I'm a hard ass. And if a kid gets out of line, I got no problem smacking him in the head.
No. We don't use corporal punishment here.
Okay, so just verbal abuse?
Mr. Schneebly, if you have any problems with any of your students, you just send them to me. I will do the disciplining.
Check.
That movie, Mike and I watched it recently. It absolutely still holds up.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is very good. I wish the child actors. Oh, actually, I just saw a meme that 2 of the kids from that.
Oh, by the way, we're talking about School of Rock.
Are still together.
2 of the kids.
2 of the kids who acted in that movie got together.
Oh, that's so nice.
And are dating.
Well, then the drummer kid recently passed away.
Oh, no.
The drummer who passed away, his name was Freddie.
Oh, are you serious?
In the movie.
Wow, that's crazy. That's sad. Every kid in that movie is super talented. Anyway, so Fred pins a lot of his ambitions on Charles at an early age. Fred views Charles as the heir to his business empire. Obviously, could never be Freddie. And he rode him so hard. Charles grew up with the impression that he was being picked on, and he was. As an 11-year-old boy, Tearfully pleading for his parents to reconsider, Charles is shipped off to the first of several boarding schools, this one in Arizona from Wichita. He's 11. Imagine if Charlotte is shipped off to a boarding school at 11. And the reason is crazy, and we'll get into that in a little bit.
I need to hear the reason.
Charlotte is Mike's nephew.
Niece.
Yeah. Who's 11. And
Right.
like, I cannot imagine. Like,
Captain Lee to an 11-year-old. I got a one-way ticket flight for you.
that's so funny.
I'm not afraid to give you a one-way ticket
He
flight.
goes, I feel like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. I love
If
Captain
you're looking
Lee.
for sympathy, it's somewhere in the dictionary between shit and syphilis.
So eventually, as Charles grows up, he moves into his Ted Turner era. And as Charles admits, there was little about his teenage self that suggests he was destined for greatness. Quote, Charles acted out, got into fights, stayed out late drinking, and sowed his wild oats. I hate that. What do you call that? Idiom? I hate that. David called his older brother a bad boy who turned good and said Charles did some awful things as a teenager. And eventually Charles is sent to another boarding school, a military academy for high school. Quote, it was a miracle that such a successful business person developed from such a rebellious kid, said a family friend. And this book doesn't really get into the details of Chucky's deviance like the Ted Turner book did, but it must have been pretty bad. And remember, Ted Turner's shooting rounds out of his college dorm. All right, you ready for the next one? Now we have the twins. Mike, if you can go. Oh, they're so cute. This is Billy and David. They're very cute in little sailors outfits, it looks like. So May 1940 came the birth of fraternal twins, David Hamilton Koch and William Ingraham Koch. What people
Ingram.
I think it's Ingraham, and the reason I say that is it's that specific name is going to come up at the end of the story.
Ingraham?
Ingraham. When people describe Bill, they describe his wicked temper and his extreme jealousy of Charles, who's 4.5 years older than him and his twin. Charles viewed Bill as a walking time bomb. He'd lash out, he was violent, he'd throw tantrums. Bill's volatile emotions made it difficult for him to concentrate in school, and his worried parents eventually sent him to a psychologist who advised that the only way to help Bill was to remove the source of his smoldering resentment, Charles. And that's why Charles had to go to boarding school.
Here's your one-way ticket, kid.
Yeah. We had to get Charles away because of the terrible jealousy that was consuming Billy, Mary told a New York Times interviewer. How crazy is that? Charles is 11, screaming, crying, asking his parents not to send him away to boarding school because his brother can't stand to be around him. Talk about a sibling rivalry. Talk about deep-seated trauma that will follow these children into adulthood. For David and Billy, once Charles is out of the picture temporarily, their childhood is kind of standard fare for affluent kids. They were raised by nannies. Fred is working. Mary's at cocktail parties with their older brother. When Fred was home, his kids basically spent their days looking for dad's approval. Billy says, when you're one of 4 kids, the only currency you have is the love of your father. And we all fought for that. And I think that these kids don't realize that that's not normal. Like, I see this in the Murdochs, and I see this in this one where, like, and even Ted Turner, he's like, I was just always looking for the approval of my father.
Yeah, like currency. It's always alarming when somebody says attention is currency.
Especially when they become so rich.
Family.
Isn't that ironic? They're rich in money, not necessarily rich in fatherly love. When Charles was home from school, he made it pretty clear that he preferred hanging out with David, which made Bill even more upset. Quote, Charles and David were so much alike. They were always really good friends, and Bill probably felt a little left out, said their cousin. Charles always had quite a following of girls, and so did David. And Bill, I think he would have liked to have more girls following him. He was not as gregarious and outgoing. Bill felt like the family geek. His self-esteem plummeted. For a long time, he says, I didn't think I was worth shit. Can you kind of see where this story is going? You kind of have David and Charles, who are compatriots, and then Bill and Fred are almost on the outs, and they're going to team up together. Yeah, but at least
Fred has his mother.
Yeah.
You know? And the women of Wichita.
Yeah.
Bill doesn't have anyone.
Totally. Eventually, Bill and David have to pick high schools. David picks a fancy Ivy League prep school, and Bill chooses the military academy that Charles went to. Mary's alarmed by this. She later confided to an interviewer that her son had become unhinged in his fixation on Charles. So here they grow up. we have Bill on the right, David on the left. Here they are playing basketball for MIT. During high school, they kind of separate. They become their own people at their different boarding schools, and then they meet up together at MIT for college. That's where their dad had gone, and Charles had gone too, and he still lived there. They all studied chemical engineering. Freddie had gone to Harvard, and I don't know if he was there at the time, but they're all kind of hanging out in Boston. And right back again, the rivalry picks back up. Bill is always trying to keep up with Dave. He always felt inferior and always felt like Dave got the best of things.
Yeah, Bill was a bench rider.
Is that true?
That's what my reading said, that David averaged like 10 points a game. They weren't tracking minutes at the time, but Bill's stats were much, much lower.
They're pretty tall, right? They're definitely over 6 feet.
David's definitely taller and definitely looks more athletic, right?
Yeah, he looks more like a basketball player.
Yeah.
Then Billy looks a little more scrawny. After college, Bill and David get their master's degrees in chemical engineering, and they go off to various engineering jobs. David has a reputation as a hardworking playboy. He enjoyed regaling friends and dates with tales of exotic travel, polar bear hunting in the Arctic Circle, stalking boar in the Hungarian countryside, which again is, I think, calling back to, wasn't there an episode of Succession where they did that?
Boar hunting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Boar on the floor.
Exactly. And I think they're in Hungary, if I remember correctly. So that might be a direct callback. Eventually, he joins the family business, and he's known for working hard and partying harder. He's working late into the evenings. During the summer months, his Park Avenue office building shut off air conditioning at 5 p.m. And the sun went down. David could often be found in his office, stripped down to his boxer shorts and a t-shirt, plucking away at his calculator. And by the time it's 1970, Bill is also working for Koch Industries. Okay, let's move to the next one. So here's Charles and Fred. I think this is probably right before his death because Charles looks pretty close to 32. What?
He looks like the Zodiac.
I know. I think a lot of people in the 60s
everybody looks like. I think those. Yeah. I think
it's the glasses.
It's the glasses.
The jawline.
But I also think that the like when they were drawing the Zodiac killer, it's just like any man. Anyone. It could be anybody.
Yeah, it's so true. So Charles takes over the family business when he's 32, and right away he leverages the classic business boy strategy of me want bigger business now. And he goes, wait a second, this company can transport, process, and trade oil. But what if it transported, processed, and traded other things good too?
Is that your Kevin impression?
It's kind of like a cross between Kevin and Zoolander. He gets into animal feed and agriculture, highway, tennis court surfaces, telecommunication. He didn't necessarily desire to be rich. He just wanted to be everywhere from an early age. And from the book, his methods worked. The company was growing at a head-spinning pace. Charles had inherited an enterprise with 650 employees and a value about $50 million. Over the next 15 years, Koch Industries' value rose to $1.5 billion, and the company employed 7,000 people. You'll notice one person who isn't involved with the company, Freddie. He has a 14% stake in the company, but he's not on the board. He doesn't work for the company. He's living off dividends and collecting art in New York City. Over the years, Charles once said, I had accepted my father's analysis of Freddie not being a whole person, of being a person who was amoral and not capable of true feelings towards other people. You know what's fucking funny, Chucky? This is what people are going to say about you when you die, you pea-brain projecting poo-poo head.
It's interesting though, right? So Freddie's not part of the business. He owns 14% stake. So you said he's collecting dividends, right? So when you look at their ownership, these guys are rich on paper, but that's it.
Yeah. And we're going to get into that because that's a big issue for them. Because
but I think it's important to call out now.
Yes.
That they're not a public company.
No.
They're a privately traded company. So any business decisions, essentially Charles is the one who's making the business decisions, but he only has to answer to his brothers. And he does, at this point, he doesn't really have to. They just trust him to make the best decisions.
Or they don't really have a choice.
Yeah.
He's stronger than them into making those decisions. You ready for the next piece of corporate gossip?
Mm-hmm.
The next piece of corporate gossip is Fred Sr. is dead. Charles is our daddy now, and you better believe he's going to take all of his unresolved trauma and unexamined political beliefs and make all of our lives miserable. So here's a picture of Bill, Charles, and David in mass. So by the early 1970s, Charles is like a maniac trying to grow this company. Here's a quote. To say that Charles was a workaholic underplayed the depth of his addiction. He spent what spare time he had studying heady books on economics, philosophy, and organizational psychology, amassing knowledge that he could channel into Koch Industries. Charles wanted to show the world that he wasn't just a trust fund kid who had been handed the keys to a kingdom. He was an empire builder in his own right. He almost killed us, said a quote, because this was his whole soul. He worked long hours, weekends, and holidays. He finally got married, and we were delighted to see that because he stopped working weekends.
Yeah, so in my book, I read very, very similar stuff. So he's going in on Sundays, and then he's creating an environment where other Koch employees felt they needed to do that, like well into the 80s and 90s almost. Wow. And then during the week, he's always the first one in the office, like completely empty Koch Industries. Charles is walking in first.
I mean, it's fine if you want to show up to the office on Sundays and the first thing in the morning. Your name is on the building, but my name isn't on the building. And so I shouldn't be held to the same standards. Anyway, so they mentioned that he gets married. He marries Liz Boozy in 1972, and they have 2 kids, Elizabeth Robinson, October 1975, and Charles Chase, who goes by Chase in 77. And during the 70s, Charles is becoming increasingly radicalized libertarian, which makes sense. He's creating this massive earth-destroying conglomerate during the Carter administration, whose environmental regulations are probably becoming a little annoying to Koch. And so that's when he attends libertarian summer camp. So he'd go to these retreats called the Freedom School, led by this guy, Richard Lefebvre. And he'd attend seminars with other white men, and specifically white men, as women or people of color were pointedly excluded, on the banalities of socialism and the philosophy of freedom. Milton Friedman also taught classes at the school, no surprise. Richard Lefebvre ends up becoming pretty radical, even within the libertarian community, and Charles eventually tries to distance himself from the organization, but we got the receipts. He sat on the board. He donated $7,000 to the school in 1964, which is $70,000 today. There is no doubt that he, at least at this time in his life, was a fairly radical Ayn Rand type libertarian. And this is where he realizes that as a businessman, he has the opportunities to shape public policies to his liking. This is like a light bulb moment for Charles that is going to change everything. Because before this, I mean, his dad was a part of the John Birch Society, but it was really like just a social club. He didn't go out and try to operationalize his beliefs. He didn't try to get certain politicians elected or change public policy or like go on these systematized campaigns that we're about to describe. So Charles' strategy focuses on grooming the intellectual class. Again, this is from the book. Through education, research, funding, other efforts who would in turn shape public opinion and influence lawmakers. The quote unquote intellectual war would not be won overnight. It took years to bring this country around to believing that government could solve the problems better than the market, and it will take years to get rid of that destructive notion. Belief that government participation is necessary or helpful and that governments are beneficial needs to be challenged. And it's important to note, despite what we see now, before this point, there wasn't a ton of libertarians out there. It was like a relatively unknown political philosophy. Most people were union members. Most people were enjoying like the social safety net that had been created by FDR and LBJ. And so said another way, he wants to evangelize these libertarian beliefs: limited government, low taxes, business-friendly, billionaire-friendly policies. And in 1977, he co-founds the Cato Institute. Had you ever heard of this institute?
The Cato Kalin Institute? OJ's roommate?
No, just the Cato Institute. Here are some of their positions. Privatization of government institutions like NASA, Social Security, the Postal Service. I don't know what these guys have against the Postal Service. They're a great band.
Boom. Wow, that was good.
That was right on. I just made that up too. Public schools, public transportation, and FYI, privatization means that a company would take it over. So instead of NASA, we'd have SpaceX. Instead of the subway, we'd have boring company tunnels. And yeah, you get why that's a bad idea. These public utilities cannot be organized for profit. Not like Elon makes a profit, but you know what I mean. They're against the minimum wage. They're against overtime regulations. They oppose child labor prohibitions. I wonder why. Charles is like, I had to work when I was a kid and I want everybody else to. They're against universal health care, affirmative action, antitrust laws, and any form of welfare.
Are they still against child labor prohibition?
This is on their site.
That's a pretty shocking stance to take.
I don't know. This is like, I don't know, maybe not on their site. It's on Wikipedia. They oppose campaign finance reform. They love climate change denialism. Each year they give out a Milton Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty, which is like giving out a Jack Welch Prize for most layoffs. But they're pro-gay marriage, which is kind of ironic.
What's the angle on that?
Well, they don't think the government should be involved in anything.
Perfect.
Yeah.
You want to know what's the scariest thing?
I think they're probably pro-choice, I would imagine, as well.
You want to know the scariest thing?
Yeah.
What they do works. Let me tell you a little something. Okay, so the Cato Institute was fighting this thing called cap and trade, which is basically a tool to combat climate change. I won't go too far into it because I doubt anyone's interested in cap and trade. But anyway, they were fighting this legislation, right? And they were putting out a bunch of videos, articles, and getting a lot of people to disbelieve in climate change. So in 2008, they took a survey and found that 71% of people believed that climate change was real. In 2009, only 57% of people believed it was real.
And that's directly related to their efforts, disinformation campaigns.
Yeah. I mean, and think about all the blockbuster movies that came out as well. The Day After Tomorrow, 2012, all those movies, and people are still not believing in climate change, which is the real issue here.
Absolutely. What we're going to realize is their strategy worked, unfortunately, and we are still facing the consequences of that strategy.
I also included some fun videos. I included a video about the Cato's climate change expert.
Yeah.
And then I also included, just for good times, a Tucker Carlson Cato speech, which I'm sure we could pull some things out for, but it just kind of gives you an idea of what these guys are into.
And their main thing, and we just saw this in the first Republican debate where Vivek Ramaswamy said more people die from climate change policies that impact the economy than climate change itself. That's their position.
I think he said more people die of climate change policy.
Anyway, so speaking of being on the debate stage, do you want to go to the next slide, Mike? Here's David Koch running for vice president for the Libertarian Party in the 1980 election. This would be the election that Reagan won. They knew they wouldn't win, but they wanted to spread their philosophy to the American public, and the Kochs had money to burn. And you can kind of just see the early inklings of Koch creating this populist libertarian movement under the guise of freedom. But what they don't say is it's freedom for them. Personal and corporate taxes, reduce those, minimal social services for the needy, much less oversight of industry, especially environmental regulation. These views just so happen to benefit the Koch family. And you'll see as we go through this story that Chucky really doesn't pick his foot off the gas through the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and eventually, like literally early this year, he has a crisis of conscience and is like, oopsie, but we'll get into that later. Do you want to take a break before we move to the next part?
Yeah, can we stop calling him Chucky?
Okay, fine. We'll call him Charles until he asks us to call him Chucky earlier this year.
In the time, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And we're back. You ready for the next piece of corporate gossip? At the Koch family Christmas party, Bill confronts David and Charles over stealing his Dolce Gabanna lifestyle and wagers a war that will destroy the family. So let's meet up with the family at Christmas dinner at their mom's house in 1974.
So at this point, right, Bill is eventually promoted to VP of Koch Carbon, which is a coal mining business. So as VP, some of his direct reports start noticing some differences compared to their fearless leader, Charles. So from work ethic, a lot of Koch employees, including Charles, would come in on Sundays to get a head start for the week on work. While Bill's energy traders were digesting reports and planning out trades for the following Monday, you could catch Bill at home watching football. Also, people much preferred working with Charles. They considered him so much brighter and a visionary. The people who worked under Bill made that very clear to Bill. Okay, so the final interesting note is kind of the dotted lines in the org chart, right? So according to the org chart, Bill reported into Charles, but as a shareholder, they were of equal value. So what are we?
So this kind of starts Bill's organized smear campaign.
Say it as
a campaign against cream cheese.
Say it as an Upper East Side woman.
She goes on a smear campaign against Charles. Even though Bill, as you just described, isn't the most reliable narrator, drunk on Bud Lights at his football parties, a few board members actually do get on his side because they're worried about Charles. Not because the company isn't growing. It's growing a lot, but because there's a number of run-ins with government regulators. Remember, Charles is doesn't have the most respect for these bodies. By the early 1980s, the company is facing civil and criminal inquiries by the EPA and the IRS. And there's also criminal indictments by the Department of Justice over a scheme to rig a Bureau of Land Management lottery, a Department of Energy investigation for violating federal controls on oil prices and overcharging
that's a sexy headline. The Bureau of Land Management lottery rigging.
Yeah.
That's going to get people off their asses.
And can we go to the next slide? Maybe one of my favorite pictures of Bill of all time. He just wants to be rich. He wants to enjoy his riches and his wealth. And really what upsets more to Bill, not the criminal investigation against his namesake company, but the fact that he's not getting his fair share.
So what? It's like the more trauma you have, the more you want an America's Cup?
Yes, seriously. This is the second episode in a row. I don't know if they're going to come out in a row. Second episode we recorded in a row where these men try to absolve themselves of their trauma by winning a sailing trophy.
A fucking sailing trophy in Newport, Rhode Island.
Literally. So remember, this is a closely held company, as Adam talked about earlier. You can't just cash out your shares on the open market. So you end up being highly illiquid. Basically, you're only rich on paper. And so while Koch pays out a 6% dividend, Bill considers that stingy. Look at him. He's got a Rolex in the pool.
Oh, yeah. That might patina.
For what it's worth, Bill got $4 million in dividends plus a $1 million salary every year in 1980 money. Today, that's like $18 million annually. And Bill is frustrated. The book says, to Bill's mind, what was the point of being filthy rich if you couldn't enjoy it? He had other interests he wanted to pursue outside of the firm, art, fine wine, and yachting. And he wasn't getting any younger. So he wants to cash out. So he dusts off the old how to fuck over your siblings while fighting over the family fortune playbook and turn to the chapter called Shareholder Coup. Bill and a couple other board members want to take the company public. Because you can't be rich the way that these CEOs want to be rich when you own a private company. Do you remember all these CEOs that we're going to see trying to IPO every year? The main motivation for doing so is so they can turn their paper money into real money. You're not liquid because you can't sell your shares on an open market until you go public. When Bill raises the possibility of going public with Koch's top lawyer, he immediately shots down the idea. This is fucking insane. The lawyer says, this should never be a public company. If this were a public company, all the officers and the directors would be in jail. The lawyer told him without elaborating. He probably did elaborate, but Will was like, I'm taking that to the grave. So Bill sends an angry letter to Charles explaining the issues. Bill delved, again from the book, into the extremely frustrating liquidity issue, complaining that it was absurd that shareholders who were extremely wealthy on paper had almost no ability to utilize their assets. What's the purpose of having wealth if you can't do anything with it? Especially when under our present tax laws on death, they will undoubtedly end up in the hands of the government and politicians. Bill accused Charles of creating Koch Industries as a monument to business success and neglecting the desires of the shareholders, aka me, in the process. He says he's got other board members on his side and they want to take the company public. He's declaring war. The next board of directors meeting, Charles adds a line item. He says, WIK, William Ingraham Koch, has leveled serious charges. And he says that Billy's protests were a moral threat to the company, and he asked the board to give him discretion to fire Bill if he continued to attack his management.
Do you know what Bill was calling his brother behind his back?
What?
An autocrat and Prince Charles.
Prince Charles. So The next month, Charles opens up a letter from Billy. Mike, do you want to read it?
If you have irrevocably decided that you cannot tolerate me in the company simply because I disagreed with some of your management practices, then you should directly and forthrightly state it to me personally, man to man and brother to brother, rather than to fire me on the grounds that I may be disloyal.
He says, why don't you fucking say it to my face? Bill says, who can I get on my side? And he goes to old brother Freddie. Freddie still owns 14% of the company. And together with the other folks he had on his side, his side is sitting at 52%, which is enough to push through these changes. Fred had it out for Charles ever since Charles tried to buy him out of the company. And when that didn't work, he attempted homosexual blackmail. That's a quote, to force Frederick to sell. What a piece of shit. Frederick said, Charles's homosexual blackmail to get control of my shares did not succeed for the simple reason that I'm not a homosexual.
So easy.
I love Freddie. I love Freddie. So Bill goes into Charles's office. That's a door opening in 1980 and tells Charles, look, we want to get the shareholder meeting on the calendar to discuss our liquidity issues and my role in the company. And here's how the conversation went. You're embarking on a program that's going to destroy the company. You're out for revenge against me. You won't get your self-respect from attacking me. You and the shareholders should be cheering on what I've done for the company instead of complaining.
Charles, let's talk about what we want to do here.
Billy, you're the type of person that if the bullet is ricocheting around the room and I say duck, you want to debate the merits of the bullet.
Charles, all I want to do is talk to you about how to improve the company.
Well, Billy, you hate me. You're out to get me.
No, Charles, that's not true.
We need a divorce.
Well, Charles, if you're not going to call the meeting, then I'll call it.
One piece of advice our father gave me was that if you want someone to hate me, make him a lot of money. I didn't understand it at the time, but I understand it now.
We're both scumbags. Sorry, I added that in. That was improv.
Okay, so Charles phones David right after that conversation and tells him what's going on. David scurries over to Frederick's house and gives him a heads up. Freddie acts, this is crazy. So David goes over to Freddie's house and is like, oh my God, you will not believe what Billy just said to Charles. Freddie acts like he has no idea what's going on. He's like, shareholder fight? Really? Wow, how about that? But in fact, he knew all along. Billy had called him months before. So the letter shows up at Charles's house announcing the shareholders meeting to discuss going public. It's signed by Bill and by Fred. And David calls Charles and said, Freddie played dumb. The older brother and David's twin are planning a coup. I'll be David.
I'm just going to be a Southern Belle.
Okay. I got this notice, Freddie. What's going on?
Well, I think it's time for a change in management of Koch Industries.
Why do you want to fire Charles? He's done a great job.
Well, are you surprised?
And this is me. You fucking dum-dums. You guys ice out your brother your whole life and blackmail him for being gay. Obviously, he doesn't like you. And so next, David calls Billy. You ready to be Billy, Mike?
How old is Billy?
He's the one you just did.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. Not before
Bill.
That was Bill is the one with our lower jaw. Ring, ring.
He's old.
Yeah, they're all in their 60s. Ring, ring.
Hello?
Are you going to fire Charles?
No, we're not. We have no intentions to.
You're lying. You're no brother of mine. I never want to have anything to do with you again. Click.
So my book went into a little bit more detail about where they were and what was happening. This meeting with the shareholders happened like the days after Thanksgiving. And Charles and maybe David at the time were in Aspen. So they had to like quickly gather their things and eventually get the other shareholder, pick him up on the PJ, and then go back to Wichita. So they're like crisscrossing the country from Aspen to get the shareholder votes they need, which is exactly what I feel like happened in Succession.
Yeah.
They're like trying to garner all the votes they can and like flying around the country. This is truly what it was.
Yes, they go to Bermuda.
At the worst time possible.
Yeah. So eventually, David and Charles change the balance of power when they use, this character comes up again, John Howard Marshall II to guilt trip his son. Again, very similar, because doesn't that happen in Succession where the father, Sonny, and then the daughter, Sonny, remember, but the father's like extremely old at that time. So John Howard Marshall guilt trips his son, who was on Freddie and Billy's side, to come over on his side. And Bill eventually calls off the meeting. And at this point, Charles is like, I can't trust you anymore. I need to fire Billy. So he gets the board together to fire him. One by one, 4 hands goes up, but David votes no. I'm not going to vote against. That's my twin. We shared a womb together. On the one hand, he's furious for Bill for throwing the company into turmoil. He literally just told him he didn't want anything to do with them. But on the other, this is his twin. And he wants to maintain the connection to Bill. Like, Charles could care less. It didn't matter. His vote wasn't needed. Bill was out. And so basically at this point, Bill is like reverting back to being a baby. This is a kid whose intense hatred towards Charles was the reason his parents sent Charles to boarding school. He's putting up this big fight and losing it, and then being fired by his brother. It's putting him over the edge. It's from the book. Cloistered in his Dover, Massachusetts mansion, he spent his days plotting with his lawyers and vegetating in front of the television. This was the worst time I'd ever seen him in his life, David recalls. He was almost paralyzed, almost lifeless. At one point, Bill asked David to come see the psychiatrist who has been helping him dig through some of this family trauma, and here's how it went. The psychiatrist spoke for about an hour and a half on why I needed psychiatric care, David remembered. I asked the doctor what I could do to help my brother get him out of this depression and terribly unhappy state he was in. And he said, there's nothing you can do until you straighten yourself out. According to David, when he spoke to Bill a few days later, Bill reported that the psychiatrist had told him that his twin was totally under the control of Charles. It's interesting how many of these episodes we've done that have cameos from family psychologists like Murdoch, Ted Turner, and Koch. And it seems like they'll get to the point of going to see a mental health professional, but when they remember the experience, they'll be frustrated that they didn't hear what they want to hear. Like, this is the only person in their life who's not going to tell them what they want to hear. So Bill is fired, and Charles still has Freddie and this other group of dissident shareholders to tackle. He negotiates an agreement to buy them all out for $1.1 billion. Bill gets $470 million. Freddie gets $330 million. Bill extends his hand towards his brother. We're still brothers. I care about you. Charles ignored him. He turned and strode briskly out of the conference room, trailed by his lawyers. After he left, Bill crumpled heavily into his chair and buried his face in his hands. Tears were in his eyes. Oof. But eventually he kind of takes that anger and runs with it. He embarks on a decades-long campaign to prove that Charles cheated him out of money. And by 1998, they're headed for court. The whole family has to testify, including their mother, Mary, who just suffered a stroke.
So what do you think? Should we wrap it here?
I think this is a good place to stop for this part, and then we'll pick it up next week with more on the Koch family.
Very nice.
Next time on part 2 of the Koch family, Toxic Kings. Bill Koch turns into a corporate vigilante as he takes the Department of Justice and the FBI on a private tour of the grounds where all the Koch corporate secrets are buried. A courtroom fight as dramatic as a Beverly Hills Housewives reunion, with siblings rehashing decades-old conflicts and clawing at their share of billions of dollars. And Bill Koch's son Wyatt asked the Sharks to invest $100,000 for a 10% stake in his Palm Beach Broke men's blouse line. That's all next week on the Corporate Gossip Podcast.